Good evening. I'm Paul Fredette. Good evening. And with me here in the studio is my wife, Karen. And together, Karen and I minister to hermits and to religious solitaries throughout the world. Here, from our home in the mountains of western North Carolina, through Ravensbread Ministries. We'd like to take this opportunity this evening to welcome all of you who have been reflecting with us over the past few months on the nature and essential features of eremitic life, on a life of silence, solitude, and simplicity, especially in its resurgence over the last 50 years. We want to welcome any of you who might be joining us this evening for the first time, and to, by way of introduction, say that for the last few weeks, we've turned our gaze to the future, and we're looking at the horizon. Where is eremitic life headed? What will eremitic life and the life of religious solitaries have to be in order to remain a viable sign, a valuable witness and contribution to the world that we live in today? We've used over the last few weeks as a point of reference, a template, if you wish, to look at this, the beatitudes as they are found in the Gospel of St. Matthew. We started at the very bottom rung of the ladder, as Jim Forrest would put it in his book, The Ladder of the Beatitudes. We started with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And then we examined, "Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted." We went on then to look at the blessedness of the meek and the lowly, who are promised that they will inherit the earth. And last week, we moved our considerations to looking at, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for justice, for they shall be satisfied." This evening, we move to the next rung on the ladder of the Beatitudes. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy."
Perhaps one of the most important.
Perhaps. Probably. At the risk of oversimplifying things, I would like to suggest this evening that one of the largest problems in our world today is that we have largely abandoned mercy for management. Certainly in the field of healthcare, at least in our own country, and I imagine in much of Europe, managed care has replaced tender loving care. The random acts of mercy that we were all encouraged to do, the works of mercy, because they require that we extend ourselves, that we act mercifully, has largely, at least on the large scale, been taken over by civic and governmental agencies. Granted, the problems of need, whether it's medicine, shelter, food, rescue in time of natural disasters, can be overwhelming, and a single person is never adequate to meet the need. But often, what seems to happen when we move from mercy to management is that whenever services are provided, they are provided for those who qualify. Mercy is not about qualifying. Mercy is completely undeserved. Karen?
Absolutely. Mercy is something that is given not because a person deserves it, but because there is a need.
The embodiment in the East of mercy is the goddess Kuan Yin. I'd like to show you all at least one rendition. You may be familiar with her already. This particular likeness graces our own yard. Kuan Yin is the abbreviated form in Chinese for Quan Shi Yin, and it means literally observing the cries of the world. Kuan Yin is the goddess of mercy, she who hearkens to the cries of the world. And the cries really signifying in the Chinese the lamentations. And so she is the embodiment of compassionate loving kindness. This evening, as we go on to consider what it might mean for us, especially for hermits, to embody this particular beatitude, blessed are the merciful. Perhaps the figure in repose of Kuan Yin might be a very apt one to keep in the back of our minds. Karen?
In our world today, mercy is really a very rare attitude to come across. It is so misunderstood that many people consider it a sign of weakness rather than a virtue, something that one should neither ask for nor extend to others. For they feel that mercy is not fair, or so it might seem. Instead, it appears that you give people breaks that they don't deserve. But if we were only to get strictly what we deserve, I think we would be in a rather pitiable situation personally. Most of us really need something more than just we deserve. We need the caring kindness, the compassion. That is what is mercy. And we also need to extend it to others. Thomas Merton ended one of his earlier books, The Sign of Jonas, with this simple sentence: mercy, mercy, mercy. He was speaking of divine mercy and alluding to the truth that the human family is surviving solely because divine mercy. It is also a hallmark of the truly human person, what a hermit of the future is striving to be and to embrace. The Latin word for hermit is misericordia, which means a heart for misery. And that means you don't always embrace the clean or the sweet, but those who are truly suffering. In a cartoon that we had in one of our Ravenspread newsletters that Paul drew, our little friend, would-be hermit, is busily laying in supplies for the coming winter. There are bags of seed, there's cobs of dried corn, baskets of apples, and he's preparing for the visitors who he knows will soon be arriving in his hermitage. and many of them will be mice, squirrels, birds, rabbits, and even deer, who had no doubt given him grief throughout the summer months when he was trying to cultivate the very things that he was going to give them in the winter. Not what they deserved, definitely, but a merciful helping from the supplies that they had once raided.
The saying goes, what goes around comes around. Well, that being said, few people reviewing their lives have much reason to expect exceptional rewards for how they've treated others. When it comes to the Great Commandment, most of us focus on how we would want others to treat us rather than how we would be treating them. We hope for mercy, but how much do we sincerely expect it? In Luke, the injunction is clear and unequivocal. Jesus says that we are to be compassionate, for this is the inner quality, the inner virtue from which all mercy springs. The ability to suffer with, to genuinely allow the experience of suffering to enter into one's own heart and mind and soul. Be you compassionate even as your Father is compassionate. And its corollaries. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Mercy is not about us assessing who is deserving of mercy and who is not. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. Mercy is something we show, something we extend as gift. And if we can extend it, then it will be extended to us. However, all too often, we're also among those who drag that adulterous woman to Jesus in order to point their fingers in righteous indignation, while at the same time trying to entrap the man who is known for his mercy. Clearly, if we associate with the scribes and the Pharisees who felt that they understood the law so well, and that law was not compatible with the kind of mercy that Jesus practiced. But Jesus foiled their attempt to ensnare him when he said, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to cast a stone at her." Now we have to remember that the law, as stated in Deuteronomy, prescribed that the person who cast the first stone had to be an eyewitness to the crime, to the offense. And that would have been, in this case,
Yes.
since women were not permitted to bring an accusation of this gravity, the witness had to be a male. Thus, the man who tossed the first stone would practically be admitting his own guilt, his own participation in the adultery, and could hardly be said to be without sin.
Yes. In another gospel incident, Jesus and his apparently always hungry disciples are walking through a field of standing grain. And as they go, they break off the dried heads, rub the seeds in their hands, and nibble on them. Now, the ever-present Pharisees, and we do have to ask how they happened to get into the field with Jesus and his followers, immediately began to complain to Jesus. They said, "Look, your disciples are doing what is forbidden on the Sabbath." And what was forbidden? Stealing, destroying someone else's property, trespassing, eating without washed hands. No, the disciples were working. They were rubbing the grain between their hands.
Exhausting.
It's terrible work. Jesus obviously was so incensed with this kind of nitpicking that this is one of the few times in the Gospels where he came out and declared who he was. First, he quoted various parts of the Torah, which showed how the priests were allowed to do certain things on the Sabbath, and it was not considered illegal, or could, even though it technically could be called work. He also reminded them that their greatest king, David, had actually gone into the sanctuary and taken the showbread, the bread that was reserved for the priests, and given it to his men to eat when they were hungry. Now Jesus proclaimed, "I tell you, someone greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would never have condemned these innocent men. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." In saying this, Jesus came perilously close to being condemned himself, not only for declaring something that could be construed as blasphemy, but by insisting that mercy was more important, a higher good, than sacrifice or the law itself. The accusation brought against his disciples was so flimsy an application of keeping the Sabbath holy that Jesus was willing to risk his reputation and angered the men who eventually had him crucified. But in addition to teaching about mercy, Jesus also showed mercy not only to his disciples whom he defended, but also to those Pharisees whom he was trying very hard to educate in the true meaning of the law. The Gospel shows Jesus quoting this same scripture passage about God's preference for mercy over sacrifice when he was at table with, quote, the sinners and tax collectors. Actually, it was Matthew, one of his own disciples that he was sitting with, a man who was officially outside of the law. Now, Jesus had already broken the law by sitting down with these sinners. And the law-abiding Pharisees, who would never fraternize with such people, happened to be around, and one wonders about how that may have happened. They were close enough to the scene.
Maybe they just liked a good meal.
Yes, but they wouldn't sit down and eat it with these sinners. One has to wonder, though, that they were close enough that they could complain to Jesus, and they did. They said, but interestingly, Jesus did not call them on labeling the dinner guests as sinners, but instead, he used that fact as a reason for being there himself. He said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Jesus, as a model of the truly merciful, not only refrains from punishment, but also from any name-calling or condemnation.
The desert fathers and mothers understood this fact. At least some of them did some of the time. And we have this really telling story revolving around Abba Moses, who at one point had been invited to a council called by the other brothers to censor one of the brothers in Skeet. Well, at first, Abba Moses declined to join this group, but he had been urged repeatedly. And so finally he took an old basket filled with sand along with him. And when the brothers pointed out that his basket was leaking sand, the old man said, "Here I come, with my sins trailing out behind me, and I don't even see them. Yet I'm asked to pass judgment on another." Well, the brothers understood, and they pardoned the brother that they had intended to condemn.
Mercy is a virtue which can be practiced even by a hermit who's living alone. For mercy is much more a disposition of mind and heart than even of an action. It's a disposition which inclines a person toward compassion and kindness. The hermit of the future, and we would hope of today as well, will continue the service that solitaries of the past have always rendered, that of being a listener and a friend to everyone who calls upon them. Father Cornelius Wenzel, a Camaldolese, in his book, The Hermitic Life, wrote this: "A friend is a person who provides us with the shelter of love and who brings us the gift of peace and tenderness. The hermit is called upon to be the friend of every one of his brothers and sisters. When he listens with love and silence to all of their troubles and secrets that others entrust to him, he does not intend to judge, to evaluate, or least of all, to condemn them. On the contrary, he lets their words flow so they can be freed from their own anger, their own self-condemnation, their own fear or sorrow, and so begin to experience the natural and spontaneous joy that is their right. The only thing that is really needed," said Father Wenzel, "is a simple presence of love that brings warmth and peace to the deepest levels on the human personality. In other words, mercy."
In the societal climate of today, with its pervasive loneliness and in so many places culture in crisis, the growing secularization of the culture, the growing divide between the classes of people, we believe many hermits will be called upon to be spiritual guides. In the past, people seeking God had persons in the social structure to turn to. Their pastors, their ministers, their rabbis, their imams. But today, with as much secularization as there is in so many societies, larger and larger numbers of the population claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. They are not part of a religious community, a church, a synagogue, a mosque. So sadly, for many, many thousands of people, those institutional spiritual guides no longer exist.
They're not available to them.
And it may well be that consecrated lay people, people known to live lives of prayer, who will be required to step into the gap by deliberately making themselves available to spiritual seekers. Hermits of today and tomorrow can become models of true mercy. It's a very delicate and complex calling. A solitary offers himself or herself in the service of every one of his or her brothers and sisters, never asking in advance, and this is extremely important, never asking in advance whether or not the seekers are in quote-unquote good standing with the religious authorities. More than likely, they're not, which is why their cry for help is so poignant. If they've been labeled as the modern-day equivalent of the tax collector or other assorted sinners that Jesus consorted with by representatives of a religious denomination, then their pain may be even deeper and their wounds far more critical. Like the man on the roadside who was laying there robbed and injured by the side of the road and passed up by the priest and the Levite, the sole hope of some of these people may be in a quote-unquote good Samaritan, someone who may not be acceptable themselves at the great temple in Jerusalem. This particular hermit may worship on a mountain well beyond the Jordan. But they may also prove that they are among those whom the Father seeks, those who bear that same compassion, refuse to judge, refuse to condemn, willing to pardon. Those, in other words, who worship in spirit and in truth, in the mercy that they bestow.
Above all, the hermit does not judge. Most of us feel we have to protect ourselves from others to prevent them from taking advantage of us by studying them, by actually judging them, because we feel that we may be at risk if we don't. Whether we realize it or not, it is actually a very heavy burden to be carrying.
It certainly is.
To be always assessing other people and trying to decide whether or not we can trust them.
They are worthy of our help.
Whether they are worthy of, whether they deserve to be trusted.
Mm.
The mature hermit stops judging others. He has no need, he has no fear of them. And he sincerely hopes that others will not be judging him or her. We know a man who's been imprisoned for over 40 years on charges that are relatively minor. He has admitted his mistakes. He has served far longer than his original sentence. And yet the parole board continues to tack on another 5 years, another 7, another 10, and the law permits it. Our country appointed an attorney for him who really had no interest in helping him. He was a man without financial help. And if you have looked at our judicial system these days, you may have realized something. It supposedly operates on the assumption that one is innocent until proven guilty. But if you read the newspapers, once a person has been accused, no matter how flimsy and how inadequate the accusation may be, he's suddenly in the position of having to prove himself innocent.
Mm-hmm.
The burden of the proof is now on his side, not on that of the accusers. And our country now has many laws that were designed to satisfy not justice, but the most vocal, the most outraged, or the most frightened people. It is not a legal system that is just, and it is certainly not one that is merciful. Our friend's case is, unfortunately, not unusual. We have quite a number of inmates who subscribe to Raven's Bread newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
And they are trying their best to make a good life in a terrible situation. Recently, we received a letter from a relatively young man, only in his early 30s, who said he is serving a life sentence in solitary confinement. And he would hope that someone would be willing to write to him to see that the Saul he had been was turned into the Paul he is now trying to be. The hermit of the future will be a spiritually mature person who is spontaneously gentle and discreet, capable of displaying great empathy for those who seek his or her support. Our society is now changing so quickly, at such a rapid pace, that people often find themselves without a sense of their own identity. The solitary is one who has gone into the desert to recover their own sense of their self, and often are the most qualified to help others do the same. The hermitage of the future is not an enclosed fortress, cutting the prayerful hermit off from the rest of the world, but rather it has an open door, inviting those in need to stop and rest a while. It is the place where the sign, "Trespassers will be prosecuted," is converted to read, "Trespassers will be forgiven."
Hermits, like all of us, live in a world that transcends differences. Hermits have to be people of dialogue and reconciliation, even in the midst, or especially in the midst, of their own silence. They have to be people of understanding and people of friendship in the midst of their own solitude. The mercy that must shine in a hermit's heart is a reflection of the mercy that they themselves continually receive.
No one realizes how much they need to give mercy until they know they've received mercy.
And maybe, unless people know how much they have been the recipients of mercy, they find it hard to extend mercy. The gift that a merciful person offers is one that they themselves have already been given. When the divine judge asked the woman taken in adultery, where are they, those who condemned you? She replied in wonder, no one, sir. Then Jesus, the only person present who was without sin, simply said, neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on do not sin anymore. We can only hope that this was one woman who never forgot how she had been saved through sheer mercy, and who then extended mercy, that same mercy, to others.
For we not only need to be merciful to others, we should be keenly aware of how deeply we need God's mercy. At the Last Judgment, Jesus describes in the Gospel of Matthew what would happen. He said, truly, whatever you did to the least of mine, you did to me. And we may ask, well, where and when have I seen you? And when have we ministered to you, Lord? And he will say, giving us a very practical listing of merciful activities, whenever you fed the hungry, gave drink to the thirsty, clothed the naked, provided hospitality to the homeless, cared for the sick, and visited prisoners, you did it to me. Clearly, works of mercy are also any action, any goodness offered to others who are unlikely to be able to return the favor.
And are also probably unqualified, do not meet the qualifications to be recipients of those acts of mercy. Mercy is not dependent on people having filled out the correct forms and provided the correct answers.
No, we are asked to be especially kind to these individuals who have been dehumanized by the system or made into targets of blame. Most hermits may not get the chance to perform some of these more obvious works of mercy, but there is another class of good works which should be their specialty. In fact, Dorothy Day, well known for her work of providing food, shelter, and physical care for the down and out, made particular mention of what has been often labeled the spiritual works of mercy, which consist in counseling the doubtful, admonishing sinners, instructing the ignorant, comforting the sorrowful, bearing wrongs patiently, forgiving all injuries, and praying for the living and the dead. Hermits are frequently called upon to fulfill these good works. They are meant to be done with a very special attitude, an attitude that St. Vincent de Paul highlighted
Yes.
when he said, "It is only because of your love, only your love, that the poor will forgive you the bread you give them." It is the attitude with which we exercise any act of kindness that makes the difference between a meaningless action done perhaps to just assuage our own guilt and a truly merciful gesture which gifts the one who receives it with human dignity. Those who know how to give to others with love and mercy will also be recipients. Paul and I both love this particular story, which Dostoevsky relates in his classic, The Brothers
Karamazov.
Karamazov. Thank you. Perhaps you've also heard this, but I'm sure you'll want to hear it again. Once upon a time there was a woman, and she was wicked as wicked could be, and she died. And not one good deed was left behind her. The devils took her and threw her into the lake of fire. But her guardian angel stood thinking, "What good deed of hers can I remember to tell God?" And then he remembered, and he said to God, "Once she pulled up an onion and gave it to a beggar woman." And God answered, "Well, now take that same onion, hold it out to her in the lake, let her take hold of it and pull. And if you pull her out of the lake, she can go to paradise. But if the onion breaks, she can stay where she is." The angel ran to the woman and held out the onion to her. "Here, woman," he said, "take hold of it, and I'll pull." And he began pulling carefully, and had almost pulled her all the way out, when other sinners in the lake saw her being pulled out, and they all began holding on to her so that they could be pulled out with her. But the woman was wicked as wicked can be, and she began to kick them with her feet and said, "It's me who's getting pulled out, not you. It's my onion, not yours." No sooner did she say that than the onion broke, and the woman fell back into the lake of fire and is burning there to this day. And the angel wept and went away.
When we stop loving, that is hell. I'd like to take the rest of the time that we have to share this evening with some prayerful meditation. And we begin, as always, by asking a blessing on the light. And so we bless this light in the name of the one who creates life, in the name of the Savior who loves life, and in the name of the Spirit who is the fire of life. I'd like to start this evening with a meditative song from an album that we've already offered you selections from. It's an album entitled A Woman's Song of God. And these are texts from the great women mystics of our tradition that have been arranged by Briege O'Hare and that are sung by Marie Cox. And this one in particular is from texts from Mechthild of Magdeburg. And we've already played a few texts of hers already in these presentations. This one is entitled, Pour Out Compassion and Mercy. I'd like you to just get comfortable, relax, breathe deeply, focus your minds.
a stranger, comfort the lonely of heart, and offer them your friendship and my justice you impart. So far as you do these holy deeds, with all the love of your soul, then you will resemble me, your God, and I will make you whole. So pour out compassion and mercy from the depths of your heart, and give to the poor and the broken the service of your love. And so far as you do these holy deeds, with all the love of your soul, then you will resemble me, your God, and I will make you
This evening, although we've alluded to it already in our presentation, I'd like to read again the account from St. Luke's Gospel of the Good Samaritan in the context that Luke presents it to us. The story goes, on one occasion, a lawyer stood up to pose Jesus this problem. Teacher, what must I do to inherit everlasting life? Jesus responded, well, what's written in the law? How do you read it? And so the lawyer answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, you have answered well. Do this, and you shall live. But the man, because he wished to justify himself. Amazing, isn't it, how our search for righteousness oftentimes comes perilously close to looking for self-righteousness. The man, wishing to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And so Jesus recounted this story. There was a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho who fell prey to robbers. They stripped him, beat him, and then went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. He saw him, but continued on. Likewise, there was a Levite who came the same way. He saw him and went on. But a Samaritan who was journeying along came on him and was moved to compassion at the sight. He approached him and dressed his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and then hoisted him on his own beast and brought him to an inn, where he cared for him. And the next day he took out 2 silver pieces and gave them to the innkeeper with the request, "Look after him, and if there's any further expense, I'll pay you back on my way back." Jesus then asked, "Which of these 3, in your opinion, was a neighbor to the man who fell in with the robbers?" And of course, the lawyer answered, "The one who treated him with compassion." And so Jesus said, "Then go and do the same." And Jesus continues to say that to each one of us. Go and do the same.
Our prayer for this evening is, "You have taught us, O Christ, to love our neighbor as ourselves. You have taught us to see our neighbor as part of ourself. Let us see ourselves in those who are hungry. Let us see ourselves in those who are frightened. Let us see ourselves in one another and in every creature. For you have taught us, O Christ, that we are one body."
Now, in the silence of our own hearts, in whatever way we are moved, let's give thanks for the events of this day and pray together for the life of our world. Renew me this night, O Lord, in the image of your love. Renew me in the likeness of your mercy, O God. May any refusal to forgive that lingers with me from the day, any bitterness of my soul that hardens my heart, be softened by your graces during the night. Renew me, Lord, in the image of your love. Renew me in the likeness of your mercy. We want to thank you all for being with us this evening to continue sharing these reflections. And we want to remind you that we welcome any comments or questions you may have. Feel free to reach us by email, pkfredette@frontier.com, or visit our website, ravensbreadministries.com, and there on the Contact Us page, you'll find an easy way of reaching us with whatever comments, questions, observations, or whatever else you'd like to share with us. Again, we thank you, and we ask God's blessings, the blessings of heaven, the blessings of earth, the blessings of sea and of sky, on those we love this night, and on every human family, the gifts of heaven, the gifts of earth, the gifts of sea and sky. Thank you once again. Good night, and God bless you.
God be with you.